Rain, rain, go away, come again another day. Constant rain. It never seems to stop raining here in Australia, and this doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon on the horizon. It's wet and it's going to stay wet for at least another 6 months, according to reports here in Australia. In fact, the Bureau of Meteorology, if you take a look here, have forecast a wetter than average September to November, which is likely for the eastern 2/3 of Australia. So if you haven't had enough rain, there is more on the way, ladies and gentlemen. And we need to ask the question, why is this type of thing happening? Why are these strange weather events intensifying, repeating? What really is the reason behind this? Of course, they will talk about the La Nina weather systems. And of course, natural climate cycles do play a part in the weather that we're seeing. But what is really behind the unprecedented nature? Is it climate change, or is there something deeper beneath the surface? I was recently taking a look at this piece published on TOTT News. It's a newspaper clipping from the Sydney Morning Herald from 1951, posted this back in September of 2018. And what this shows is a CSIRO physicist who was discussing different ways to make it rain, because they had already discovered seeding clouds with dry ice or silver iodide crystals. But he was talking about spraying low-hanging clouds with water and the effectiveness of it. And this comes from Weather Modification History, a fantastic website which has archived a lot of the history. This is a technique that has been mastered over 7 decades here in Australia. And there's a lot of discussion about the role that geoengineering played within the mass floods across Australia. Hello everyone, welcome back for another video here on the TOTT News YouTube channel. And today what we're going to do is take a look at the aftermath of the Australian floods. Now I say aftermath, but as you can see, it really hasn't stopped and isn't going to stop any time soon. So I was waiting to do a video that would be the flood aftermath video, but there really is no aftermath. This is a continuous cycle, and perhaps these videos will become an ongoing series, especially into next year if they are predicting more and more unprecedented weather. So today what we're going to do is follow on from March's video, Feast to Famine, Mass Floods and Australia's High-Speed Rail, where we discussed geoengineering, the rain bomb across northern New South Wales, and links to the devastating areas and proposed high-speed rail plans. And this has obviously continued on from previous work on the bushfires, smart cities, and the whole picture. So if you aren't familiar with those talking points already, I do recommend you do check those out, just to get some greater context on what we are talking about here today. But it hasn't stopped raining, and even more floods have occurred here in Australia since the last video, further down the coast. And in the muddy, damped and destroyed regions that are in the thick of this, their experiences have been truly concerning. So there's a lot to talk about today, and I hope to address all of that in this video and tie in the larger Agenda 2030 links. So before we talk about the most recent floods, what I want to do is just follow up with a few pieces that are noteworthy after the northern New South Wales disaster. And we've already talked about some of the things that happened during this period, such as the ADF, which were busted staging social media PR recovery during this time, which was very embarrassing. As we all saw, they were just standing around with lights and taking photos. So we know about some of the atrocious response that happened during this time, but things have only gotten worse since then. And I want you to take a look at this and keep in mind some of the similarities between the bushfire victims and flood victims. So the first story I want to show you is that thousands of Australian flood victims are still denied government aid. This was in June of 2022. Remember, the floods that we're talking about occurred in February to March period, the end of February, the devastating Northern Rivers region floods. More floods have occurred since then, but as of June, many months later, thousands are still denied government aid. We move on to another article. This was from the end of March, right during the crisis period. Flood victims were being kicked out of crisis housing to make way for tourists. And we've seen the scenes that have come out of areas, particularly Lismore, which was devastated, where people were living in their cars and their tents for months, and many still can't find aid. In fact, just last month, take a look at this. At the end of July, just a few weeks ago, Lifeline defends decision to sell donated items intended for Lismore flood victims. Former Lifeline store manager Ethan Smith says he has resigned in disgust after boxes of donated items were sold in Lifeline stores when they were intended for flood victims. Unbelievable. But at the same time, what can we really expect? I mean, when the bushfires happened, many of the so-called charities that were looking out for people just kept the donations for themselves. And now the same charities have raised over $25 million for flood victims. How many of those have seen the money? Take a look at this piece by the Sydney Morning Herald from June 15th. Less than 10% of a $250 million rental support fund has been distributed to New South Wales flood victims. Less than 10% as of June, many months after the floods have occurred. So you wonder where the money's going. We can see it's not going to the victims, is it? As we can see, the inquiry heard that more than 3,000 people are waiting for rental support, despite the program set to end in less than 2 weeks. Give me a break. If history tells us anything, they shouldn't expect this coming in any time soon. And where does that leave us? That leaves us with flood refugees. Australia now has flood refugees. And it really is a phenomenal thing to see. Some of the stories of these people, some of the areas that have been devastated. Many people, including members of TOTTnews.com and the broader community, people like yourself watching this video, have reached out from these areas. They understand, even if they weren't familiar with geoengineering before, that this was something that they've never ever experienced or even heard of from their family members. And many of these people are still trying to rebuild. And as we've just highlighted, for months and months and months, this has been an ongoing battle for them. An ongoing battle just for assistance. As we can see here, the PTSD, the trauma is real. If it rains, we freak out. These are some of the stories. Look at some of this devastation from these houses in these regions. Unprecedented scenes. In fact, the response from the government was so bad that it's actually been blasted in a flood inquiry report. They even have talked about abolishing Resilience New South Wales. Government agencies in one state fail communities who had their lives ruined by a large-scale flood disaster, a damning report has found. Now, this is from August 9th. So this is the reason I'm making this video here, is the flood inquiry has now come out, which confirms everything that we've spoken about. The government and their services were not there for the people. And why is that? Why could that be? So take a look at some of these recommendations. Finding 9. Notwithstanding the role of the New South Wales State Emergency Services to perform rescues, individual members of the community had no other option but to ignore government advice and save lives, which was only possible due to local and historical knowledge and local communication, giving information from the New South Wales State Emergency Service and the Bureau of Meteorology was incorrect and out of date. Finding 10. The New South Wales Government's management of evacuation centres in February-March 2022 floods lacked coordination and leadership and failed to clearly incorporate the role of community organisations. They talk about animal welfare, no visible leadership. Resilience New South Wales failed to engage and coordinate community groups. The New South Wales Government's lack of streamlined grant processes for applicants meant that they were repeatedly interviewed and had to relive their experiences, leading to frustration and trauma as part of the grants process. Administration errors. No assessors on the ground. The New South Wales Government failed to adequately prepare effective temporary and long-term housing solutions for those who became displaced. No engagement from First Nations people. Where have we heard that before? Local councils. The list goes on and on. So it's been confirmed now in this Legislative Council inquiry that the flood response was an epic failure, an utter failure by both levels of government. And these areas are still experiencing weather anomalies. I mean, just last month, hail/snow hit Byron Bay in a rare weather event, which was described as very dramatic. Take a look at some of this, the hail in these regions. And as we've noted before, Byron Bay is very close to Queensland. It's not far down in the colder regions. It's normally very tropical here. It's only a couple of hours south of southeast Queensland. And this is just as early as the 13th of July. So it's not that these communities are able to just rebuild like nothing's happened. There is a continuation, and it's going to continue on and on. And why is that? Why could that be? Well, if you've seen some of our previous videos, you'll understand that there is potentially a greater agenda here to ensure that these people don't rebuild. And I think that the evidence that we've just shown here about the lack of response that was intentional, including flood victims being kicked out and everything that these people have had to go through, this is unacceptable. And I think that this highlights what we're talking about in regards to the fact that potentially someone doesn't want them to rebuild, and we'll talk about that in a second. But right now I want to move on to the next round of floods. As I said, I was ready to make an aftermath video, but the rain hasn't stopped. In fact, it's raining today as I'm recording this video, August 13th, 2022. It's been months since our last video, and since then there has been constant rain. And from the northern regions of New South Wales, the geoengineered rain bomb continued further down. And in this is where the Hunter regions were severely affected, and the Central Coast regions. This was in July. So 5 months after the floods had hit the northern regions, the rain bomb has come down to the Hunter and Central Coast regions. What are the odds of that? And of course, something else had changed during this period. Can you guess what it was? It was our Prime Minister. And where was Albo? Well, Albo was overseas during this period, wasn't he? Defending his international travel as he was overseas, and in fact, even delaying flood support payments. So it doesn't matter whether it's ScoMo, doesn't matter if it's Albo, two wings of the same bird, ladies and gentlemen. Two wings that don't care about the people in these regions. But don't worry, if you are devastated by the floods in these regions, you can get yourself the hefty amount of $1,000 to help support you. While the government gives hundreds of millions of dollars to Ukraine and other regions and other projects, don't worry about that. You can pick up $1,000 for your troubles. So this is some of the updates of what has occurred both right after, directly after the floods that devastated the northern regions, and now updates about the lower Sydney regions, the Central Coast regions, and the Hunter regions. Rain, rain, rain. Never-ending rain. And what I'm trying to get at here, folks, is are you starting to see a pattern here between each natural disaster in terms of lack of support, in terms of lack of care, in terms of the regions that are affected? Why doesn't the government care about people? Why could that be? And this is where the larger pieces at play start to come together, because some people might think that this is more than just a coincidence. And this isn't just me speaking. I want you to take a look at this piece by the Sydney Morning Herald by Ben Cubby in July of this year. Disaster capitalism, business has found an upside to fires and floods. And of course he talks about the climate change related floods and fires that have plagued Eastern Australia. But it's not the climate change narrative that is important. It's this concept of disaster capitalism. It's big business, and we've seen this since the days of every war that we've ever seen. Companies like Halliburton getting paid to rebuild nations that are destroyed in wars. Catastrophe business is booming. And this is where he's right about this, and it's great that someone has brought highlight to this point, because all of these businesses are cashing in. All of these Northern Rivers reconstruction corporations, which were established by the state government. Look at this, 2,334 property assessments have been carried out so far for them to repair costs. And there is a big scandal that this group is profiteering from the disaster of people in these areas. And this is something that we've seen time and time again. Disaster capitalism. The upside to the fires and floods. And who is this an upside for? The businesses, the private interests, the government interests behind those private interests that all want to see something built in its place, that want to build back better after these disasters have occurred. And this is where the larger links come into play. If you take a look at this article by Sky News Australia, 1 in 25 Australian properties will be uninsurable by 2030 due to climate change, report warns. 521,000 properties could be uninsurable by the end of this decade due to climate change risks. Always the climate change meta-narrative. But the big thing to highlight here is the 2030 number, and that 1 in 25 Australian properties will be uninsurable. Can you take a guess where those uninsurable properties will be? And what's going to happen during this disaster? And we've already seen this occur with the floods and the bushfires. Climate change experts are calling out for the New South Wales government to buy back Sydney homes left uninhabitable by the floods. So the government should come in, guys, because of big bad climate change, buy back everyone's properties and save the day. Save the day. Because these places will be uninhabitable, there will be lack of insurance, and because of climate change, things are just going to keep getting worse, guys. This is what the government talks about. But is this really the case? Or are we seeing a good old example of problem, reaction, solution. And here is the icing on the cake. You remember how in the last video we drew links between Australia's high-speed rail line and some of the devastated flood regions in this area. And if we see here, Central Coast has now been devastated since this video, but we also have Lismore on this stop, don't we? Which perfectly aligns even to the curvature of the proposed high-speed rail line through that area. So we spoke about this in the last video, and would you guess, ladies and gentlemen, Anthony Albanese unveiled his vision for high-speed rail in Australia during his overseas trip, right before the second floods had devastated the Central Coast region, and he announced that he hopes to collaborate with Japan on getting this done.
My foreign minister knows is a particularly obsessive one of mine, my vision for high-speed rail in Australia, and no country has done that more than Japan with the Shinkansen.
What are the odds of that, ladies and gentlemen? So bushfires, COVID economic lockdowns destroying the regions, and floods, all in the convenient zones, all along the high-speed rail line, and a vision that was so unobtainable just 3 decades ago. And for the last 3 decades, discussions ongoing, the cost of how much it would be for infrastructure to clear all of this land, to buy all of this land. Well, now they've been presented the perfect opportunity. And is this all a coincidence? Well, for me, it doesn't seem that way. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Am I the crazy one for seeing how this could all possibly be by design? Known geoengineering tactics, which have been verified by people that have been on the ground witnessing this, witnessing the spraying for months and months on end. When all of these links start to come together, when high-speed rail is now predicted to be a vision, we wait for the October budget to come out for how these funds are going to be allocated and how this work is going to begin. Well, of course I'm crazy, ladies and gentlemen. Don't mind me. The fact checkers come out. They've debunked all of this. They have told us that conspiracy claims about New South Wales and Queensland floods fall flat. In fact, they released this article 2 days after my Feast to Famine video was released. What are the odds of that? The same APP that highlighted TOTT's names, saying that we were talking about conspiracies during the bushfires. Now this time, look at this. Cloud seeding caused record-breaking floods in Queensland and New South Wales. False. So maybe I'm just a conspiracy theorist, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe the constant lack of support, the stealing and selling off of all of the assistance, the no housing, the continuous weather events for them to not be able to rebuild, the report that told us that the response was absolutely inadequate. Maybe all of this is just a conspiracy theory. That delayed flood payments, that 2 different prime ministers who don't care about the people, or maybe this is all just a coincidence. Maybe it's just climate change and all of these government entities should come in and buy up everything to save the day. What do you guys think? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. But if I'm a betting man, and from what everything has taught me, not just over the last 2 years, but over the last few decades, I don't tend to trust the people that are running the show when they try to tell me these things, because they are perpetual liars. And we know that their agencies themselves have mastered how to create weather, how to manipulate weather for over 7 decades. More than probably most employees in these companies have been alive for. So when they come out and try to tell me that it's climate change and that I'm a conspiracy theorist, I tend to dismiss that. But potentially you dismiss me. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section below. Do these admitted, known cloud seeding and weather manipulation techniques, were they responsible for these floods and for the continuation of this rain, which isn't going to end anytime soon, is it? Another 6 months of rain. It's raining right now as I'm filming this video. Hopefully you couldn't hear that in the background, but I couldn't wait any longer. It's been months since the last video and you've just got to go for it. There is no end. And potentially that is all for a reason. But we know, regardless of whether this is connected or not, the government has achieved what they've wanted to achieve. And they'll continuously now put the plan in motion. We will see a 2.5-year vision come to fruition. But maybe we're just the crazy ones. Let me know what you think in the comments section below, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure to check out the links that I've left in the info box. Some fantastic discussions on the website and on our podcast. And of course, make sure to check out tottnews.com for all the latest news and media from Australia and across the world. Australia is set to establish National Centre for Disease Control. One of the latest pieces on that website. So make sure you're tuned in to the website. You can enter your email right here and get notified when new posts come onto the website. So if you're only a YouTube only person, make sure you keep up to date as much as possible, because we're very restricted and limited to what we can do here on YouTube in the age of censorship. So I will wrap it up there. The follow-up to the floods, the aftermath, but we can't really call it an aftermath because things are just going to keep rolling on. And people like myself think that this is potentially for a reason. Drive them out, drive them to the highly sophisticated smart cities and build high-speed rail to connect them all. This is the future. This is the fourth industrial revolution. And you wouldn't put it past these people. It really isn't that hard to imagine when you really break it down. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Ethan Nash signing off, and I will catch you all in the next video. Cheers, guys.